They lived among us, or so people believed. The woman next door, the lonely widow, the herbalist in the woods. Any one of them could be a witch, and in the Middle Ages that fear could kill. The belief in witches was not born overnight. It grew slowly, fed by superstition, religion, and fear of the unknown. In medieval Europe, life was hard. Harvests failed. Cattle died without reason. Children got sick and never recovered. And when tragedy struck, people asked, who caused this? Here's a fact. By the 14th century, the Catholic Church officially taught that witches were real and that they served the devil. What began as folklore turned into doctrine. And once the Church declared witchcraft heresy, fear spread like wildfire. Not everyone was at risk. Accusations often targeted the weak, the powerless, and the different. Widows who lived alone. Old women with knowledge of herbs. Midwives who worked with childbirth. Even poor peasants who simply looked strange. Another fact, women made up nearly 80% of those accused of witchcraft in Europe. To medieval society, a woman without a husband or protector was suspicious. Independence was dangerous. Silence was damning. And a bad harvest could become proof of a curse. But fear was not only about individuals. It was about control. The Church preached that witches made pacts with Satan. That they flew through the night to secret gatherings called Sabbaths. That they poisoned wells, spoiled crops, and even killed infants. These terrifying images gave priests power, and ordinary people an enemy to blame. Here's another chilling fact. One of the earliest official documents against witchcraft came from Pope Innocent VIII in 1484. His papal bull Summis Desiderans Effectibus declared witchcraft a crime against God. It set the stage for the book that would become infamous, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. But even before this, by the 14th century, accusations and executions had already begun. Imagine living in a small medieval village. Your neighbor's cow dies suddenly. They say they saw you gathering herbs at night. They whisper you cursed the animal. The gossip spreads. Soon, the priest calls you to answer questions. You are not guilty. But in a world consumed by fear, innocence was fragile. Here's a fact. In the German-speaking lands, which fears were strongest. By the end of the Middle Ages, entire towns would conduct hunts where dozens, even hundreds, were accused at once. But even in the 14th century, the seeds of mass hysteria were already sown. Fire, disease, and famine fueled the terror. Every lightning strike, every storm, every death could be explained by one word: witchcraft. And because no one could disprove it, anyone could be accused. So the fear of witches was not just fear of the devil. It was fear of hunger, fear of sickness, fear of chaos in a world people could not control. This was only the beginning. The accusations would grow. The punishments would darken. And soon Europe would burn with a fury that killed tens of thousands. It did not begin with fire. It began with words, a whisper, a rumor, an accusation. In medieval Europe, witch trials often started with something small. A cow stopped giving milk. A child fell ill. A storm destroyed the harvest. And someone asked, who is to blame? In a world with little science, accidents felt like curses. If your neighbor's bread rose higher than yours, perhaps she had used magic. If a widow survived a famine while others starved, people whispered, she must have made a pact with the devil. Here's a fact. Many witch hunts began with personal grudges. Neighbors quarreled over land. Women argued over gossip. Men competed for status. Accusations of witchcraft became weapons. Once suspicion took hold, it spread quickly. One accusation led to another. Fear was contagious. If one woman was called a witch, her friends and family might soon be accused as well. Here's another fact. During the 15th and 16th centuries, entire villages in Germany and Switzerland turned on themselves. A single rumor could lead to dozens of trials. In one German town, more than 300 people were accused within a few years, many of them children. But who were the most common targets? The poor, the widowed, the elderly, midwives, healers, and women who lived alone. They were vulnerable, easy to blame, and unable to defend themselves. Midwives were especially feared. They worked with childbirth, a dangerous and sacred moment. If a baby died, suspicion often fell on them. Some believed they offered infants to the devil. Others thought they poisoned mothers. A profession meant to save lives became a dangerous one. Here's a chilling fact. In the French city of Arras in 1459, dozens of people were accused of attending a witches' sabbath, a night gathering where witches were said to dance with demons. The evidence? Rumors, confessions under torture, and the jealousy of neighbors. The process was simple. Person was accused. The priest or judge asked questions. If the accused denied guilt, it only fueled suspicion. Silence was taken as proof. Tears were taken as guilt. The more someone defended themselves, the more guilty they seemed. Imagine being a peasant woman in a small village. Your husband has died. You live alone. You gather herbs for medicine. And one day your neighbor's child gets sick. The whispers begin. Soon, the priest knocks on your door. There is no evidence, only fear. But fear was enough. Here's one more fact. In England, a woman named Alice Keitler was accused in 1324 of witchcraft. Long before the great hunts began, she was said to have poisoned her husbands and worshipped demons. Though she escaped, her servant Petronilla de Meath was burned alive, one of the first recorded witch burnings in Europe. So accusations did not need proof. They needed only fear. And once a rumor began, it could not be stopped. The stage was set. Accusations filled villages and towns. The next step would be darker. The church would take charge. And what began as gossip would become official trials, fueled by books, laws, and fire. The whispers had grown too loud. The rumors had spread too far. And now the church would take control. What began as gossip would become law. What began as suspicion would become fire. By the late Middle Ages, witchcraft was no longer seen as just superstition. It was officially declared heresy, a crime against God. That meant it was the job of the Inquisition to find witches, judge them, and punish them. Here's a fact. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV approved the use of torture in inquisitions. Originally, it was used against heretics. But soon, it was turned against those accused of witchcraft. Accusations became formal investigations. Judges demanded confessions. And if confessions did not come freely, they were forced. The rack, the strappado, where victims were hung by their arms until shoulders dislocated. Thumbscrews that crushed bones. Confessions poured out, but not truth, only pain. The church also produced manuals for witch hunters. The most infamous was published in 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it became the handbook of persecution. Here's a fact. The Malleus Maleficarum declared that women were more likely to be witches because they were weaker in faith and more carnal by nature. This book spread across Europe, teaching judges how to question, torture, and condemn. It was second only to the Bible in its popularity during the late Middle Ages. Imagine the scene. A village woman is accused. She is brought before a panel of priests. They demand to know if she has attended a witch's sabbath. She says no. They demand to know if she has kissed the devil. She says no. The more she denies, the more convinced they become. Here's another chilling fact. Many trials included the witch's mark test. Judges searched the body for scars, moles, or birthmarks. Any unusual spot was called the devil's mark, proof of guilt. Sometimes they pricked the skin with needles. If it did not bleed, it was said to be supernatural. The Inquisition also used written testimony. Neighbors' words became evidence. A child's dream could be entered into record. The standards of proof were so low that almost anyone could be condemned. But the true power of the Inquisition was fear. Once a trial began, the whole community was drawn in. People testified against their neighbors to protect themselves. Others accused simply to settle old scores. The Inquisition gave authority to the chaos of rumor. Here's one more fact. In the Spanish Inquisition, witchcraft was sometimes treated less harshly than in Germany or Switzerland. Spanish inquisitors often dismissed cases as superstition. But in Central Europe, the hunts became far bloodier, because the Malleus encouraged relentless pursuit. So witchcraft had become more than whispers. It was a crime against God. It was a threat to the church. And in the hands of inquisitors, it became a machine of fear. The stage was set for the darkest moments. Trials turned into executions, and Europe would soon see fire in every town square. When proof was impossible, they asked God to decide, and they called it justice. These were the ordeals, trials by water, by fire, and by iron. In the world of the witch hunts, survival was almost impossible. If a judge could not find evidence, the accused was put through an ordeal. The idea was simple: God would protect the innocent. But in reality, the tests were traps, designed so that no one could win. The most famous was the ordeal by water. The accused woman was tied and thrown into a river or pond. If she floated, it meant the water rejected her. She was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, but often drowned before she could be pulled out. Here's a fact. Records from 16th century Germany describe entire groups of women being tested in rivers, surrounded by cheering crowds. Few survived, regardless of the outcome. Another ordeal was the ordeal by fire. The accused might be forced to walk barefoot across burning coals, or carry red-hot iron in their hands. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent. But infection was almost certain, and even survival could take weeks of agony. There was also the ordeal by prayer. Judges demanded the accused recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly. If they stuttered, hesitated, or forgot a word, it was taken as proof of guilt. Fear alone made failure almost certain. Imagine being dragged to the town square. The entire village gathered to watch. You are bound, trembling, and led to the water's edge. Children shout. Men jeer. Women cross themselves. You pray silently, knowing that no matter what happens, you are doomed. Here's another chilling fact. In some trials, witches were weighed against the Bible. If the accused was lighter than the Holy Book, it was proof of guilt. If heavier, it was still suspicious. The logic was twisted, designed to confirm what the crowd already believed. The ordeals were public spectacles. They were meant to terrify, to prove that the community was cleansing itself of evil. But in truth, they destroyed trust and spread fear. In France, England, and the German states, these ordeals became almost ritual theater. People came to watch. Children remembered the scenes for life. Justice became entertainment, and suffering became a show. Here's a fact. By the late 16th century, some rulers began to question the ordeals. Even certain church officials admitted that they were cruel and unreliable. But by then, tens of thousands had already died. So ordeals were not trials of guilt. They were performances of power. No matter the outcome, the accused rarely survived. The only truth they revealed was fear itself. The stage was now set for the final act of horror, the executions. For if the ordeals were traps, the fire was the end. The accusations led to the ordeals. The ordeals led to confessions. And the confessions led to fire. For in the end, the witch hunts always ended the same way, with death. The most common punishment for witchcraft was execution, sometimes by hanging, but most often by fire. The burning stake became the symbol of Europe's war against witches. Here's a fact. Burning was chosen not only to kill, but to purify. Fire, the church said, destroyed the devil's power. It erased the witch's body so that no trace remained. But for the crowds who gathered, it was less about purity and more about spectacle. In towns across Germany, Switzerland, and France, mass executions became almost routine. Dozens of women, sometimes men and children, were marched to the stake together. Bound in chains, paraded through streets, forced to confess one last time. The smell of pitch and smoke filled the air. Crowds shouted prayers and curses. Here's another fact. In the German town of Würzburg in the 1620s, nearly 900 people were executed in a few years during a single wave of witch trials. That included nobles, children, and even the city's own officials. No one was safe when hysteria took hold. Executions were public. They were meant to send a message, to prove that the town was cleansed of evil. But they also became entertainment. People brought their children. Markets were set up near the pyres. The death of witches became a festival of fear. Imagine standing in the crowd. The condemned are tied to wooden stakes. The priest shouts a final sermon. The torch is lowered. Flames rise. Screams echo through the square. And you believe you have seen justice, even though all you have witnessed is cruelty. Here's a chilling fact. In France, entire families were sometimes executed together. If one woman was accused, her daughters or grandchildren could be condemned as well. Fear spread through bloodlines. The executions were not limited to poor villages. Even large cities joined. Paris, Basel, Trier, all held mass burnings. And in each place, fear grew stronger, not weaker. Some rulers encouraged the killings. Others profited from them. Confiscated land and wealth from the condemned often went to local lords. Witch trials became not only tools of fear, but also tools of greed. Here's one more fact. In Scotland, over 2,500 people were executed for witchcraft between the 16th and 18th centuries. Many of them died in Edinburgh, where the flames lit up the night sky. But the fires were not endless. As the decades passed, doubt began to creep in. Some judges questioned the confessions gained under torture. Some priests wondered if so many could truly be servants of the devil. And in time, the executions slowed. So the witch hunts reached their peak not in trials or accusations, but in fire. The fire consumed thousands, and its smoke left scars on Europe's memory that would never fade. The executions were not the end of the story. They were the height of the madness. And when the smoke cleared, Europe was forced to ask why so many had died. The fires burned out. The crowds went home. But the smoke of the witch hunts lingered over Europe for centuries. The executions had ended, but the scars remained. From the 14th to the 18th century, tens of thousands of people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Historians estimate between 60,000 and 80,000 deaths. The majority were women, widows, healers, midwives, and the poor bore the weight of Europe's fear. Here's a fact. In Germany alone, more than 25,000 people were executed for witchcraft. In Switzerland, entire villages were wiped out. In Scotland, one of the smallest kingdoms in Europe, thousands were burned in just 2 centuries. The legacy was not just in numbers, but in memory. Generations grew up watching trials and burnings. Children saw their neighbors condemned. Communities learned to fear difference, to punish weakness, and to follow authority without question. The witch hunts also revealed the power of belief. The church used the fear of witches to strengthen its hold on the people. Local rulers used it to settle rivalries and seize property. And ordinary men and women used it to explain tragedy in a world they did not understand. Here's another fact. Even when science began to grow in the 17th century, belief in witches did not vanish overnight. In 1692, long after Europe's worst hunts, the famous Salem witch trials in Massachusetts showed how fear could still consume a community. The shadow of Europe's hunts had crossed the ocean. But in Europe itself, doubt eventually won. Philosophers of the Enlightenment began to ask questions. Judges demanded real evidence. Doctors rejected the idea of pacts with the devil. And slowly the executions stopped. Yet the lessons remained. Fear of witches had shown how dangerous panic could be. How easily suspicion could become proof. How quickly neighbors could become enemies. Imagine standing in a town square in the early 1700s. The pyres are gone. The trials have ended. But the memories are still alive. Old men whisper of the flames they once saw. Old women remember friends who never returned. The silence after the fire was as haunting as the screams during it. Here's one more fact. Some historians argue that the witch hunts were an early form of social control, a way for the powerful to keep people in line through fear. Others see them as a warning of what happens when superstition replaces reason. So the legacy of the witch hunts was not only death. It was mistrust. It was fear. It was the reminder that ignorance, when fed by authority, can destroy thousands of lives. Today, the witch hunts stand as one of Europe's darkest chapters. But they also stand as a warning that hysteria spreads faster than truth, that justice can become cruelty, and that fear, once unleashed, is harder to extinguish than fire. The story of the witch hunts is not just history. It is a mirror, a reminder that even in our modern world, fear and suspicion can still burn, if we let them.